The gas lamps flickered against the London fog as another woman pushed through the doors of the chemist shop on a cold evening in 1873. Her hands trembled slightly as she requested her usual bottle of laudanum, that ruby-red liquid that had become as commonplace in Victorian households as tea and sugar. The pharmacist barely glanced up as he measured out the tincture, a mixture of opium dissolved in alcohol that could be purchased without prescription, without question, and without any warning of the devastation it would wreak upon countless lives. This was the hidden face of Victorian London, a world where respectability and addiction walked hand in hand down cobblestone streets. While history books often focus on the male-dominated opium dens of the East End, immortalised in the works of Charles Dickens and later Arthur Conan Doyle, the true scale of opium dependency among women remains one of the most overlooked crises of the 19th century. These were not the criminals or bohemians of popular imagination, but mothers, wives, daughters, and working women from every level of society who found themselves trapped in a cycle of dependence that Victorian medicine not only failed to recognise, but actively encouraged. To understand how opium became so deeply embedded in the lives of Victorian women, we must first grasp just how differently this drug was perceived in the 19th century. Opium was not hidden in shadowy corners or whispered about in scandal. It was displayed openly on pharmacy shelves, advertised in respectable newspapers, and recommended by physicians as a cure for nearly every ailment imaginable. The poppy, from which opium derives, had been used medicinally for thousands of years, but it was the Victorian era that saw its use explode into something approaching a public health catastrophe. The numbers are staggering when we examine them closely. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain was importing enormous quantities of opium. In 1830, the country imported around 41,000 pounds of raw opium. By 1860, this figure had more than quadrupled to 280,000 pounds annually. This does not even account for the opium imported in already prepared medicines and tonics. When we consider that Britain's population at this time was roughly 20 million people, the scale of consumption becomes truly apparent. This was not a niche product used by a small segment of society. This was mass consumption on a national scale. Women were disproportionately affected by this epidemic for reasons that were deeply intertwined with Victorian social structures and medical practices. The 19th century medical establishment had remarkably rigid ideas about female biology and psychology. Women were considered fundamentally weaker than men, more prone to nervous complaints, hysteria, and a vast catalogue of vaguely defined ailments that were all grouped under the umbrella of female troubles. The Victorian woman was seen as a delicate creature, subject to the whims of her reproductive system, which was believed to control not just her physical health, but her mental and emotional state as well. This medical framework meant that women were constantly being treated for conditions that were either poorly understood or entirely fabricated by a male-dominated medical profession. Menstrual pain, pregnancy discomfort, postpartum depression, menopause symptoms, headaches, nervousness, insomnia, general weakness, and simple fatigue were all conditions for which opium-based medicines were routinely prescribed. A woman who complained of any physical or emotional distress could expect to walk away from her doctor's office with a prescription for laudanum, morphine pills, or one of hundreds of patent medicines that contained opium without clearly stating so on the label. Laudanum was perhaps the most ubiquitous of these preparations. Created by dissolving opium in alcohol, usually with added flavourings like saffron or cinnamon to mask the bitter taste, laudanum was cheap, legal, and could be purchased from any chemist without restriction. A bottle might cost just a few pence, making it accessible to working-class women as well as the wealthy. Pharmacists mixed their own formulations, which meant the strength could vary wildly from one bottle to the next. A woman who had become accustomed to one chemist's weak mixture might find herself overwhelmed by a stronger preparation from another shop, or conversely might find herself needing ever-increasing doses as she built up tolerance. The marketing of these opium preparations specifically targeted women. Advertisements in ladies' magazines and newspapers promoted products with names that sound almost quaint to modern ears, but masked their dangerous contents. Godfrey's Cordial, Dalby's Carminative, Mother Bailey's Quieting Syrup, and countless others promised relief from infant teething pain, children's colic, and the general difficulties of managing a household. These were opium-laced syrups that mothers gave to their babies and young children, often with tragic results. Infants died from opium poisoning with disturbing regularity, but the connection was not always made because these deaths were often attributed to natural infant mortality, which was already heartbreakingly high in Victorian times. Working-class women faced particular pressures that made opium use almost inevitable in some circumstances. Consider the life of a typical factory worker in the textile mills of Lancashire or the East End of London. These women worked 12 to 14-hour days in deafening, dangerous conditions. The machinery never stopped, and neither could they. Exhaustion was a constant companion. Pain from repetitive motions, injuries from accidents, and the general wearing down of their bodies was simply part of existence. When a woman could purchase a bottle of laudanum for a few pence and gain relief that allowed her to continue working and feeding her family, the choice seemed obvious. No one told her she was becoming addicted. No one warned her that the dose that worked today would be insufficient tomorrow. Middle-class and upper-class women faced different pressures, but found themselves no less ensnared by opium. The Victorian ideal of womanhood was suffocating in its restrictions. A respectable woman was expected to be the moral centre of her household, pious, pure, submissive to her husband, devoted to her children, and capable of managing a household that might include numerous servants and complex social obligations. She was expected to accomplish all of this while maintaining an appearance of effortless grace and never showing strain or complaint. The reality of this impossible standard was that many women existed in states of chronic stress, anxiety, and depression that went unrecognized and untreated, except through sedation. The Victorian woman was also trapped in a world with very limited options for managing legitimate pain. Dental problems were endemic and excruciating. Childbirth was dangerous and agonizing, often resulting in injuries that caused chronic pain for the rest of a woman's life. Diseases like tuberculosis, cancer, arthritis, and countless others caused suffering that 19th century medicine could do little to address except through pain relief. Opium was often the only truly effective analgesic available. A woman suffering from cancer pain or recovering from surgery had few alternatives. In this context, opium was genuinely merciful, even as it enslaved. The experience of pregnancy and childbirth particularly intertwined women's lives with opium. Pregnancy in the Victorian era was shrouded in euphemism and secrecy. Women were expected to withdraw from public life as they began to show, and the actual mechanics of pregnancy and birth were not openly discussed. Morning sickness, back pain, insomnia, and the anxiety of facing a potentially fatal ordeal in childbirth led many pregnant women to rely on laudanum. After birth, if a woman suffered from what we would now recognize as postpartum depression, the standard treatment was more opium. If she had trouble sleeping while caring for a newborn, opium. If she had pain from tearing or surgical intervention during birth, opium. The cycle could begin in pregnancy and never end. The literature of the period gives us glimpses into these private struggles. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, one of the most celebrated poets of the Victorian age, was dependent on morphine and laudanum for much of her adult life. She began taking opium as a teenager, for pain related to a spinal injury and continued for over 30 years. Her letters reveal both her reliance on the drug and her awareness of its hold on her. She wrote of the relief it provided, but also of the difficulty of reducing her dose. Yet her addiction was known to her family and literary circle and provoked remarkably little comment. This was simply how chronic pain was managed. Wilkie Collins, though male, wrote compellingly about opium addiction in his novel The Moonstone, and his personal experience with laudanum addiction informed his vivid descriptions. But it is in the private letters and diaries of lesser-known women that we find the most heartbreaking accounts. Women who started taking laudanum for menstrual cramps and found themselves unable to function without it. Women who realized they were spending money their families could not afford on their daily dose, but could not stop. Women who recognized they were trapped, but saw no way out in a society that did not even have vocabulary for addiction as a medical condition. The medical profession's role in this epidemic cannot be overstated. Victorian doctors were not evil or deliberately creating addicts, but they operated within a framework of understanding that was fundamentally flawed. The concept of addiction as we understand it today barely existed. The word addiction was sometimes used, but it meant something more like strong habit rather than the physiological dependence we now recognize. Doctors knew that patients who took opium regularly would experience unpleasant symptoms if they stopped, but this was often interpreted as the return of the original ailment rather than withdrawal. The solution, therefore, was to continue the opium. Women who tried to express concern about their reliance on these medicines were often dismissed. A woman who said she felt she could not manage without her laudanum might be told that this proved she genuinely needed it for her nervous condition. The circular logic was perfect and inescapable. Victorian medical theory held that some people simply had constitutions that required ongoing medical support, and opium was that support. The idea that the medicine itself might be creating or worsening the problem was slow to gain acceptance. The dose escalation that is characteristic of opiate addiction meant that women found themselves needing more and more of their medicine to achieve the same effect. What started as a teaspoon of laudanum once a day could gradually increase to multiple doses throughout the day. Some women were consuming amounts that would be immediately fatal to someone without tolerance. The financial strain this created could be devastating, particularly for working-class families. Women pawned possessions, went without food, and diverted money from household expenses to maintain their supply. The shame of this was compounded by the fact that they were not, in the eyes of society, doing anything wrong. They were simply taking their medicine. The physical effects of chronic opium use were severe. Constipation was universal and could become life-threatening. Women suffered from malnutrition because opium suppresses appetite. Their skin took on a characteristic pallor. They experienced mood swings, alternating between the euphoria or calm of being dosed and the anxiety, pain, and emotional distress of withdrawal. Sleep patterns were disrupted. Some women experienced vivid nightmares. Others found that opium, which initially helped them sleep, eventually made natural sleep impossible. They were caught in a cycle where they needed the drug to sleep, but the drug prevented real rest. The social consequences varied dramatically by class. An upper-class woman who was addicted to laudanum might be able to hide her condition behind the walls of her home, with servants managing the household, and her husband perhaps unaware of the extent of her usage. Or if he was aware, it might be accepted as part of her delicate constitution. She was unlikely to face legal consequences because she was not breaking any laws. Her main risks were to her health and her sanity, both of which could deteriorate slowly behind closed doors. A working-class woman had no such buffers. If her addiction prevented her from working, she and her family faced destitution. If she spent money on laudanum instead of food, her children went hungry. If she was observed to be impaired at work, she could be dismissed without recourse. The workhouse loomed as a constant threat for Victorian working families living on the edge of subsistence, and addiction could be the final push into that despised institution. Yet these women were caught in an impossible trap. The physical demands of their lives made pain relief necessary, but the only available pain relief created dependence that could destroy them. Children suffered terribly from their mother's opium use in multiple ways. Beyond the direct poisoning from soothing syrups, children in homes where mothers were dependent on opium often experienced neglect. A mother sedated into torpor could not properly care for her children. Houses went uncleaned, meals were not prepared, and children were left unsupervised. In working-class neighbourhoods, it was not uncommon for children to be sent to purchase their mother's laudanum from the chemist, normalising the behaviour and setting the stage for their own potential future addiction. There were also cases, tragic and more common than records fully capture, of women intentionally overdosing on opium as a means of suicide or infanticide. A mother facing desperate poverty, an unwanted pregnancy, or simply the crushing weight of her circumstances had easy access to a method of ending her life or her child's life. Coroners' inquests from the period are full of such cases, often recorded with terminology like accidental overdose or death by misadventure, even when the circumstances suggested otherwise. Victorian society was uncomfortable with acknowledging suicide, particularly female suicide, and records were often sanitized. The trade in opium itself had a dark imperial dimension that few Victorian women would have been aware of. The opium that filled British chemist shops came primarily from two sources, Turkey and British India. The British East India Company and later the British government held a monopoly on opium production in India, particularly in Bengal and the regions that are now parts of modern India and Bangladesh. This opium was produced primarily for export to China, where the British had deliberately fostered opium addiction as a way of balancing their trade deficit caused by purchasing Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. The Opium Wars, fought in the mid-19th century, were literally wars to force China to accept British opium imports. The moral gymnastics required to justify this were remarkable. The same British society that prided itself on moral rectitude and Christian values was generating enormous profits from addicting Chinese populations to opium while simultaneously consuming vast quantities at home. British women taking their daily laudanum were participating unknowingly in a global system of drug production and distribution that was causing immense harm across Asia. By the 1870s and 80s, concerns about opium use were finally beginning to surface in public discourse. The temperance movement, which focused primarily on alcohol, began to notice opium as well. Reformers started to document the extent of infant deaths from opiate-laced soothing syrups. Doctors began to write about cases of opium habituation, though they often focused on the more sensational cases of people visiting opium dens rather than the far more common domestic use of laudanum. Slowly, fitfully, Victorian society began to wake up to the crisis in its midst. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 was the first significant attempt at regulation. It required that opium and its preparations be labelled as poison and be sold only by registered pharmacists. This sounds more effective than it was. The law still allowed opium to be sold without prescription, merely requiring that the buyer be aware it was a poison. In practice, this changed very little. Women continued to purchase their laudanum, now from a slightly more restricted list of sellers, but still without any real oversight or limitation. The law did nothing to address existing addiction or prevent new cases. More significant was the growing awareness of opiate addiction in the medical literature. Doctors began to recognize that withdrawal from opiates was not simply the return of original symptoms, but a distinct syndrome caused by the drug itself. This recognition was crucial, but came far too late for the thousands of women already trapped in dependency. Treatment options remained limited and often ineffective. The standard approach was gradual dose reduction, but this required a level of support and medical supervision that most women could not access. Withdrawal was agonizing, involving intense pain, nausea, insomnia, anxiety, and a host of other symptoms that could last for weeks. Many women who tried to stop simply could not endure it. Some physicians experimented with substitution therapies, replacing opium with other substances like cannabis, chloral hydrate, or even alcohol. These approaches rarely worked well and often simply substituted one addiction for another. There were also more drastic approaches. Some doctors advocated for sudden complete cessation, essentially locking patients in rooms until the worst of withdrawal had passed. This cold turkey approach was traumatic and had a high failure rate, with many women relapsing as soon as they regained access to opium. What Victorian medicine lacked was any understanding of addiction as a disease requiring comprehensive treatment, addressing both physical dependence and psychological factors. There was no concept of addiction medicine as a specialty. There were no support groups, no rehabilitation facilities, no social services to help women rebuild their lives. A woman struggling with opium dependence was essentially on her own, expected to overcome it through willpower, while the same social and medical structures that had created her addiction remained unchanged. The late Victorian period also saw the introduction of new opiate drugs that were initially promoted as non-addictive alternatives to opium and morphine. Heroin, synthesized in 1894 by the German pharmaceutical company Bayer, was marketed as a safe cough suppressant and morphine substitute. It was, of course, even more addictive than morphine. This pattern of pharmaceutical companies creating new opiates and promoting them as safe alternatives to existing opiates, only for them to prove equally or more dangerous, is depressingly familiar to anyone watching the modern opioid crisis. The stories of individual women from this period are often fragmentary, preserved in medical case studies, court records, or family letters. There was a dressmaker in Manchester who started taking laudanum for menstrual pain at 16 and was still dependent at 45, her life constrained by her need to never be far from a chemist. There was a governess who lost position after position because employers eventually noticed her periodic torpor and strange behaviour. There was a mother of 6 in the East End who died from an overdose that may or may not have been intentional, leaving her children to the workhouse. Each of these women was a complex individual whose life story has been reduced to a few lines in a historical record, but they represent thousands of similar cases. Some women did manage to overcome their dependence, though the records of successful recovery are much scarcer than records of addiction. Those who succeeded often had significant advantages: family support, financial resources to access better medical care, or sometimes religious faith that provided both motivation and community support. The Salvation Army and other religious organizations did attempt to help people struggling with addiction, though their moral framework often meant they viewed addiction as a sin to be overcome through salvation rather than a medical condition requiring treatment. The Victorian women's movement of the late 19th century did begin to address these issues, though often obliquely. Campaigns for women's access to education and the medical profession meant that by the 1880s and 90s, there were female doctors who could offer women patients a different perspective. Women physicians like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Sophia Jex-Blake were more likely to question whether all female complaints required sedation with opiates. The movement for women's rights also included economic arguments that indirectly addressed addiction. When women pointed out that working-class women were being destroyed by factory labour, this included awareness of how they were self-medicating with opium to survive impossible conditions. The connection between women's oppression and addiction was never fully articulated in Victorian terms, but it underlies many of the patterns we see. Women used opium to cope with the physical and emotional pain of lives constrained by gender roles that offered them few options and little agency. A woman who could not leave an unhappy marriage, who could not pursue her own ambitions, who was trapped in a life of domestic drudgery or grueling labour, might find in laudanum a brief respite, a softening of sharp edges, a way to endure the unendurable. The tragedy is that this coping mechanism trapped them further, adding chemical dependence to all their other constraints. As the 19th century drew to a close, the opium crisis did not end so much as transform. Regulation gradually increased. The Pharmacy Acts were strengthened. International agreements began to restrict opium trade. The medical profession slowly developed better understanding of addiction, but these changes came incrementally and incompletely. Women in the early 20th century still struggled with opiate dependence, though the specific drugs and social contexts shifted. Morphine injections became more common. Heroin addiction emerged as a problem. The basic dynamic of women being prescribed addictive substances for legitimate pain and then being unable to stop remained fundamentally unchanged. Looking back at the opium epidemic among Victorian women reveals uncomfortable parallels to modern pharmaceutical crises. The OxyContin and prescription opioid epidemic that has devastated communities across North America in recent decades follows remarkably similar patterns. Aggressive marketing of powerful opiates, reassurances from pharmaceutical companies and doctors about safety. Vulnerable populations becoming dependent on legally prescribed medications. Escalating doses, lives destroyed, and delayed regulatory response. The specific molecules have changed, but the human dynamics remain depressingly constant. What can we learn from the Victorian experience? Perhaps most importantly, we learn that good intentions and legal access do not prevent addiction crises. Victorian doctors genuinely wanted to help their patients. Opium was legal and socially acceptable. Women were taking medicines prescribed by licensed physicians. None of this prevented disaster. The lesson is that we must always maintain skepticism about powerful drugs, no matter how beneficial they may seem, and no matter how respectable their purveyors. We must listen to patients, particularly women patients, when they report problems with medications rather than dismissing their concerns. We must provide support systems for people struggling with dependence rather than leaving them to overcome addiction through willpower alone. We also learn about the importance of understanding the social context of drug use. Victorian women did not become addicted to opium because they were weak or immoral. They became addicted because they lived in a society that subjected them to impossible standards, limited their options, ignored their pain, and then offered them a substance that promised relief. Any serious approach to addiction must address not just the drug, but the conditions that make the drug appealing. Poverty, lack of opportunity, chronic pain, mental illness, and trauma all create vulnerability to addiction. If we want to prevent addiction, we must address these underlying conditions. The Victorian opium epidemic also teaches us about the dangers of gendered medicine. When the medical establishment categorizes an entire gender as inherently weak, nervous, and prone to ill-defined ailments, it creates conditions where overprescription becomes inevitable. Modern medicine has made enormous strides in understanding that women and men may experience diseases differently and require different treatments, but we must remain vigilant against the tendency to dismiss women's symptoms or to reach too quickly for pharmaceutical solutions to what may be social problems requiring social solutions. Finally, the Victorian story reminds us of the importance of remembering and honouring these women's experiences. For too long, the history of addiction has focused on dramatic stories of artists and intellectuals or sensational accounts of criminal underworlds. The everyday reality of thousands of women who struggled with dependence on opium has been overlooked, dismissed as unimportant or too ordinary to merit attention. But their stories matter. They tell us truths about the human cost of social inequality, about the consequences of medical arrogance, and about the resilience of people who endured circumstances that would break most of us. The Victorian woman holding her bottle of laudanum in a chemist shop in London in 1873 was not so different from any of us. She was trying to cope with pain, to meet her responsibilities, to survive in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. She took what was offered to her by the medical authorities she trusted. She became trapped in a cycle she did not choose and could not escape. Her story is a tragedy, but it is also a warning and a call to do better, to build societies that address pain without creating addiction, that support people struggling with dependence rather than condemning them, and that recognize the full humanity and agency of all people regardless of gender. The domestic sphere, where Victorian women spent most of their lives, was saturated with opium in ways that might seem shocking to modern sensibilities. Medicine cabinets in respectable middle-class homes would routinely contain multiple opiate preparations for different purposes. There would be laudanum for general pain and nervous complaints, perhaps paregoric for digestive issues, Dover's powder for fever and sweating, chlorodyne for coughs and colds, and any number of patent medicines with innocuous names that concealed their opiate contents. A woman managing her household would dispense these medicines to family members with the same casualness that we might distribute aspirin or cough syrup today, completely unaware that she was administering highly addictive narcotics. The recipe books and household management guides that Victorian women used contained instructions for making home remedies that included opium. A conscientious housewife might prepare her own cough syrup or teething preparation using opium purchased in its raw form from the chemist. This was seen as economical and practical, a way of ensuring quality control over medicines rather than relying entirely on pre-mixed preparations. The domestic production of opiate medicines meant that women were not just consumers, but also manufacturers, blending and brewing substances whose true nature they did not fully understand. The letters and diaries that survive from this period, when they touch on the subject at all, reveal a complex relationship between Victorian women and their medicines. Some women wrote with genuine gratitude about the relief that laudanum provided, describing it as the only thing that made their lives bearable. Others expressed vague unease, a sense that they relied too heavily on their drops or their pills, but without the vocabulary to name what was happening to them. Still others wrote with surprising self-awareness about their dependence, recognizing that they were trapped but feeling powerless to change their circumstances. The Victorian epistolary culture, where women especially maintained extensive correspondence with friends and family, sometimes preserved discussions of these struggles. A woman might confide to a sister or close friend that she was trying to reduce her laudanum intake but finding it impossibly difficult. These letters reveal that women often supported each other through these struggles, sharing advice and encouragement, though the advice was usually based on personal experience rather than medical knowledge, and was often ineffective. The bond between women dealing with similar struggles created informal support networks that were perhaps the closest thing to addiction support services that existed in this era. The seasonal rhythms of Victorian life also influence patterns of opium use. Winter months, with their long dark nights, cold damp weather, and increased incidence of illness, saw heightened consumption of opiate medicines. Women dosed themselves and their families for colds, influenza, bronchitis, and the general malaise that came with living in poorly heated homes filled with coal smoke and industrial pollution. The London fog, that thick toxic mixture of smoke and mist that could last for days or weeks, exacerbated respiratory problems and drove people to seek relief in bottles from the chemist. Spring and summer might bring some reduction in use for those whose consumption was primarily for respiratory complaints, but for women dependent on opiates for chronic pain or emotional distress, the seasons made little difference. The marriage market and social expectations around courtship also intersected with opium use in ways that are only partially visible in the historical record. Young women were under enormous pressure to secure advantageous marriages, which required maintaining appearances of health, beauty, and pleasant temperament. A young woman suffering from painful menstruation, headaches, or nervous anxiety might use laudanum to help her appear at her best during social occasions where potential suitors might be present. The irony is that chronic opium use would eventually undermine the very qualities it was being used to preserve. But by then it might be too late. A woman already married and dependent on opiates faced different pressures, particularly if her husband became aware of and disapproved of her medicine use, which could create marital conflict and further stress. The Victorian obsession with invalidism, particularly among upper-class women, had complex connections to opium use. Being an invalid was in some ways a socially acceptable role for women who could not or did not want to fulfill the demanding expectations of Victorian femininity. An invalid woman could withdraw from social obligations, avoid the dangers of repeated childbirth, and claim time and space for herself in ways that healthy women could not. Opium both created and sustained this invalid identity. Women who had become dependent on opiates often developed the pallor, weakness, and general air of fragility that marked the invalid, while the opium itself was both treatment for and cause of their condition. Some women may have found a kind of freedom in invalidism, however constrained, but they paid for it with their health and autonomy. The role of servants in facilitating opium use among wealthier women deserves attention. A lady's maid might be sent to purchase her mistress's laudanum, becoming complicit in and knowledgeable about her dependence. Servants witnessed the private reality behind the public facade of respectability. They saw their employers in states of opiate intoxication or suffering through withdrawal. They might be asked to lie to husbands or family members about medicine consumption. This created a strange intimacy and also a power dynamic where servants possessed knowledge that could be used against their employers if relationships soured. At the same time, servants themselves were not immune to opium dependency, and working-class women in domestic service faced all the same pressures and pain that led to opiate use, but with even fewer resources for managing it. The intersection of opium use with other Victorian medical practices compounds the picture of how women's bodies were treated. Bloodletting, purging, blistering, and other aggressive interventions were still common in the first half of the 19th century. Women subjected to these treatments would be given opium to manage the pain and distress they caused. As the century progressed and these practices fell out of favour, they were replaced by other interventions that were only marginally better. The rest cure, popularised by neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s, prescribed complete bed rest, isolation, and overfeeding for women suffering from nervous exhaustion and neurasthenia. Opium was often part of this treatment regimen, ensuring that patients remained calm and compliant during weeks or months of enforced inactivity. The treatment often made patients worse, creating or exacerbating opium dependence while doing nothing to address the actual causes of their distress. Women writers and artists of the period had complicated relationships with opium that both enabled and constrained their creative work. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry was written while she was under the influence of morphine, and some scholars have argued that the drug's effects can be seen in the dreamlike quality of some of her work. Other women used opium to manage the physical pain that came from long hours of writing or detailed artistic work in poorly lit rooms. The drug might provide temporary relief that allowed them to continue working, but over time, dependence would undermine their health and potentially their creativity. We must wonder how many talented women saw their gifts diminished or destroyed by opiate addiction, their potential work lost to history. The connection between opium use and women's sexuality was largely unspoken in Victorian culture, but nonetheless significant. Opium suppresses sexual desire and function, which may have been experienced as either a relief or a loss depending on individual circumstances. For women trapped in marriages where sexual relations were unwanted or painful, the dampening of libido that came with opiate use might have been a covert benefit. For others, it represented another way that the drug diminished their vitality and capacity for pleasure. The Victorian silence around female sexuality means these aspects of women's experience with opium are even more hidden than others, recoverable only through careful reading of private documents and medical case studies that occasionally hint at these issues. The medical literature of the period, when it discussed female opiate users at all, often did so in ways that revealed the deep misogyny of Victorian medicine. Women who became dependent on opiates were sometimes described as weak-willed or morally deficient, despite the fact that their addiction had often been created by medical prescription. Male doctors wrote about female patients with a mixture of condescension and prurient interest, sometimes seeming more concerned with controlling women's behavior than with actually helping them. Case studies would describe women in demeaning terms, reducing them to their symptoms and moral failings while ignoring the social and medical context that had created their dependence. This medical discourse both reflected and reinforced broader Victorian attitudes about women as inferior beings requiring male control and guidance. The temperance movement's eventual attention to opium created both opportunities and problems for women struggling with dependence. On one hand, temperance activists helped raise public awareness about the dangers of opiate medicines and particularly about the deaths of infants from soothing syrups. Their campaigning contributed to eventual regulatory changes. On the other hand, the temperance framework was fundamentally moralistic, viewing drug and alcohol use as sins rather than medical conditions. Women who came to the attention of temperance workers might receive help, but it came with judgment and demands for moral reformation that added shame to their existing burden. The temperance movement also tended to focus on working-class drug use, seeing it as part of the general moral degradation of the poor, rather than recognizing that opium dependency crossed all class boundaries. The international dimensions of the opium trade connected British women to a global system of exploitation and suffering that they could scarcely have imagined. The opium fields of India, where peasant farmers cultivated poppies under British direction, the processing factories where women and children worked to transform raw opium into smokable or ingestible forms, the Chinese addicts whose lives were destroyed by British opium imports, the sailors and merchants who transported the drug across oceans, all of these were linked to the woman in London taking her evening dose of laudanum. The global capitalist system that extracted wealth from colonized peoples was the same system that supplied cheap opium to British consumers. The woman using laudanum to cope with her menstrual pain was connected through invisible threads of commerce and empire to immense suffering elsewhere, though Victorian society worked hard to keep these connections invisible. The child welfare movement that began to emerge in the late Victorian period started to document the harm that opiate medicines caused to children, both through direct administration and through the neglect that came from having addicted parents. Reformers visited working-class neighbourhoods and recorded the conditions they found. Children left alone, while mothers worked or lay in opiate stupors. Infants given dangerous doses of soothing syrups. Households where money needed for food went to purchasing laudanum instead. These observations led to calls for regulation and for better support for poor families, though meaningful change was slow in coming. The image of the suffering child became a powerful tool for reformers, more effective at generating public concern than appeals on behalf of the women themselves, which reveals something about how Victorian society valued women's lives and autonomy. As the 20th century approached, the beginning of psychology and psychiatry as distinct medical disciplines began to offer new frameworks for understanding addiction, though these were far from perfect and often still deeply flawed. Sigmund Freud's work on cocaine, which he initially promoted as a wonder drug before recognizing its addictive potential, paralleled the Victorian experience with opium in revealing how easily medical enthusiasm could create public health crises. The emerging understanding of the unconscious mind and of psychological trauma began to suggest that addiction might be connected to underlying emotional pain and unresolved conflict, not just physical dependence. This was progress, though early psychoanalytic approaches often blamed mothers and female sexuality for all manner of problems, so women gained little benefit from these new perspectives initially. The Victorian opium crisis among women ultimately faded not because it was solved, but because it was transformed and forgotten. Stricter regulations made opiates somewhat harder to obtain. New drugs replaced opium as the preferred medicines for various complaints. The women who had been dependent on laudanum and morphine in the 1880s and 90s either died, managed to reduce their consumption, or continued using, but became invisible in the historical record. The next generation faced different drugs and different social contexts, but similar underlying dynamics. The memory of the epidemic faded, which meant that its lessons were not learned and its patterns would repeat. Each new generation of medical authorities would rediscover the power of opiate medicines and would believe, despite all historical evidence, that this time they could control these substances and prevent addiction.